Whoever hijacked MH370 was carrying out a plan that was sophisticated, aggressive, and precise. It involved turning off multiple pieces of equipment just 6 seconds after the plane passed the last waypoint in Malaysia. To carry out a plan like that would have required significant planning in advance. So my goal today is to look at what that planning might have been. The hope is that by looking at what was carried out, we can understand how they planned for it. That might give us a sense of what the goal was. And that in turn might give us a sense of who carried out the act. Now, there's basically two possibilities for who could have hijacked the plane, because there's two places that you can control a plane from, either from the cockpit or from the electronics bay. In today's episode, we're going to focus on the cockpit. We're going to look at how the hijacking by the captain, Zaharie Ahmad Shah, could have been planned. We're going to look at what he was presumably trying to achieve and how he would have done that as reflected by the evidence that was left behind. In a future episode, we're going to ask the same questions, presuming that the plane was hijacked from the electronics bay. But for now, let's talk about Zaharie. What was he trying to do? Now, because the plane turned back at Zaharie 40 minutes into the flight, everything has gone electronically dark. The captain, presumably, having either incapacitated the co-pilot or locked him out, turned the plane 180, flew back over the Malayan Peninsula, up the Malacca Strait, turned into the Southern Ocean, flew 6 hours south into the remote ocean, and then, as we discussed in a recent episode, put the plane into a dive, had a change of heart, pulled it into a glide, and then put it back into a steep dive, crashed into the ocean so that small fragments from the interior were produced, and presumably killed himself in that action. So the question is, okay, how would he have planned for it, and what were his goals? And there's another piece of evidence that is relevant, which is that when investigators went to search his house, they found that he had a flight simulator in the basement. On the hard drive, one of the hard drives of the flight simulator, there was evidence that Zaharie, a month before the disappearance, had flown a 777 flight that was eerily similar to the scenario that I just described. The idea was that the plane took off from Kuala Lumpur, flew up the Malacca Straits, and then Zaharie moved the plane down into the remote Southern Ocean, set the fuel to zero, presumably glided it into the ocean. We don't know really exactly how that played out because we only have isolated data points, but that is what some have called the smoking gun evidence that Zaharie did plan this. But it's interesting to compare and contrast that flight simulator session with what actually occurred, because Zaharie did carry out flights on the 777 to the Middle East and Europe, which involved taking off from Kuala Lumpur, flying up the Malacca Straits in that exact same way. It would have been possible for him to turn south, even go electronically dark in a way that nobody would have noticed because the plane was over the open ocean. He could have disappeared effortlessly without any sense of mystery whatsoever. I mean, it still would have been the greatest aviation disappearance ever, but the plane would have flown off into the night and just no clues would have had emerged. He didn't do that, obviously. He was flying to Beijing. He also, if he was flying up to Beijing, he could have continued on his course, gotten to a part of the South China Sea where he could have taken a right and either threaded the needle between the Philippines and Taiwan, or between Taiwan and Japan, and just flown out into the Pacific and had that huge ocean to get lost in if he wanted to. So what we're left with is this strange scenario where apparently he, 6 seconds after passing Zaharie, the last waypoint in Malaysia, he did this very sneaky and evasive thing where he aggressively turned the plane after making the plane go dark, flew back and went up the Malacca Straits. And it seems like, on the one hand, he was being extremely clever and crafty and evasive, by making the plane disappear at a time when nobody was looking at it, a very brief window of time, only a few minutes, but he took advantage of it to hightail it in the other direction. And this has led some people to assume that he was trying to commit the perfect crime. First, for whatever reason, he wanted to commit this diabolical act, and he was going to just disappear, and nobody would ever be able to pin it on him. But there's a contradiction here. There's a real difficult to reconcile set of facts, which is that since he didn't fly out over the Pacific Ocean or wait until he was on a flight to Europe and head south from there, he flew over a Malaysian Air Force base, an installation called Butterworth, which had radars, which had presumably fighter jets too that could have gone after him if they were really on the ball. So this idea that he was pulling off the perfect crime by using this really subtle knowledge of avionics to prevent the plane from sending even the slightest trace of its electronic signature is really hard to reconcile. What exactly was his motive in carrying out this plan? I personally can't think of anything that makes sense. Now, readers have reached out to me in the comments section. I will share some with you. A reader, Ventus45, writes, Zaharie was a perfectionist and very much a man motivated, indeed driven, by the perfectionist's desire to, quote, do it right. This is a vitally important fact and something that most people don't, indeed won't even consider. I don't understand this idea. If he's a perfectionist, what is so perfect? I mean, he could have done a perfect disappearance by just taking it. And as I said, going to the Pacific or flying south from a flight to Europe. Why did he fly over Butterworth? It makes it not be the perfect crime in my estimation. Some people have looked at the other way. They said, well, the fact that he was kind of thumbing his nose at Butterworth meant that he was trying to embarrass the Malaysian government. He hated the prime minister, who ultimately turned out to be a crook and was sent to jail. And so this disappearance was an attempt to embarrass the Malaysian government. The problem is that it didn't embarrass the Malaysian government. It was a mystery. It was confounding and frustrating, and a lot of people, I think, were annoyed by it, especially even in Australia. I would say if his point was to send a message, why didn't he send a message? Why didn't he say what his goal was and be explicit if he thought that doing this would somehow further his political goals? So, frankly, I invite readers to, in the comments section, tell me what they think is a plausible scenario that explains why you would do this set of things that is neither super secret, an inscrutable, unsolvable mystery because it left no clues. He left lots of clues, but he also wasn't really identifying himself with it in a deliberate way. So I'm baffled, frankly. Okay. So he flew south to kill himself and everyone on board the plane in a very long and complicated procedure. And he put it into it. He waited 6 hours. Initially there was speculation from the Australian authorities that maybe he took a fatal overdose of a drug or something to kill himself and then let the plane fly south. We now know, because of this BFO data that we discussed in a recent episode, that he must have been awake to put it into a dive, or whoever took it was awake to put it into the dive. So why would you do that? You're killing yourself in the most prolonged way possible. For what benefit? Again, I'm going to defer to Ventus45, who sent me a PDF which describes this plan. He says, I believe that Zaharie had meticulously planned this mission long ago. Everything was dependent on the endgame. He fully intended to alight on the sea surface around dawn. He knew that he needed to remain in the dark for as long as possible, only becoming visual at low altitude and twilight. This has to do with the timing of when the sun was setting or rising in that part of the ocean. Only becoming visual at low altitude and twilight to be able to align with the swell so as to be able to, quote, alight on the surface. Note, I use the word alight deliberately. I want to emphasize the point that this was not a ditching, as in an emergency landing to land a plane on a body of water, but was indeed instead a fully planned and controlled water landing like a seaplane or flying boat at dawn. So it's perfect, but in what sense is it perfect? He's now so great. Now you've landed your plane intact, Sully style, on the ocean. You're 1,000 miles from the nearest land. You're going to die. You're going to drown, probably. I guess you could probably improvise a raft and then die of exposure, or get eaten by sharks or something. I don't understand this plan. Even from the context of someone who is, who we will allow any of a menu of psychological ailments, I don't understand what psychological ailment would motivate you to want to die like this. But here's the thing: when we look back at something that happened, it has an air of inevitability to it. So of course this thing happened. Of course he did this, because we know that he did it. So he must have done it. He must have wanted to do it. It's hard to imagine someone looking forward prospectively, making a plan and thinking, okay, I'm going to carry out this elaborate series of steps that is going to result in me triumphantly sitting atop a floating 777 full of dead passengers awaiting a pretty unpleasant fate. I don't understand how you were going to exult over the perfectionism of that plan having been achieved, personally. Okay, from this kind of broad, trying to read the tea leaves of what happened, I want to turn to a more specific aspect of the hijacking that we can look at in a lot more detail. And this is something I brought up in the past, but today we have a rare opportunity to get into it in unprecedented detail. And this is the question of the reboot of the satellite data unit. How was it turned off and turned back on again? How could it have been planned for? What could have been the object of this operation? And to help me with this, I am extremely gratified to say that we have with us today Ron Rogers, who is not only an extremely experienced 777 captain, but an extremely experienced and talented YouTuber. So let's get to that in a second, because first I have to say my inevitable thing, which is, please, if you like this show, please like and subscribe. If you're listening to the podcast on audio, please rate it, give it as many stars as you can possibly give it, and recommend it to your friends, because it really helps a lot. We are trying to reach out to the public. I feel that this is a very important case. I think it's really important that we, the entire society, humanity, needs to understand what happened to this plane, so that we can prevent it from happening again. And so with that, with no further ado, let me turn to Ron Rogers. Thank you, Ron, for taking the time to join us today. This is really exciting. You are a notable YouTuber, as well as a highly experienced pilot. So people can visit you at Ron Rogers on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And you are a retired United Airlines captain.
Yes.
With many decades experience. I think you were flying for 30 years.
36 years when I retired. Yeah, I've just I received the Wright Brothers Award for 50 years. I've got 53 years of flying now.
Wow.
Yeah. Started out in the Air Force before that.
How did you start to fly?
I basically couldn't afford it. My dad was a firefighter at the time, and we just didn't have the money. So the only way I could really get into flying was having somebody else pay for it, and the Air Force was more than happy to do that. So they paid for me to get 35 hours of flight time, and at the time, if you completed the course and did well, you could get your private pilot's license. So they paid for my 35 hours. I did it in 6 weeks, and I got my private pilot's license, and then went on from there. Flew a little aerobatics early on, and then went in the Air Force, and just went on from there.
So you have a really interesting career in aviation. You got your undergraduate degree in electrical engineering.
Yes.
You joined the Air Force. You flew trainer jets, is that right?
Yes, I was a T-37 instructor initially, and then I got a job as a chase pilot out at Edwards at the Flight Test Center. And
Wow.
I was working on a double master's and in electrical and aero engineering, and they wanted to put me in a ground job in the idea was to put me in charge of the F-16 flight control development there out at Edwards, and I wanted to still fly. And all my friends were getting airline jobs, and I didn't want to sit behind a desk, so I decided to go with the airlines, and it was a great move. I miss the military flying, I sure do. It was a very great career. Out of my 36 years, I spent 25 years as captain, so that was very, very fortunate.
I want to ask you about that, but I want to ask you one last thing about the Air Force. You probably chased some interesting things at Edwards.
Yes, yes, I did. It was a great time back in the late 70s. I mean, it was the F-16, F-15, A-10, B-1 programs were all going on. The Space Shuttle was just starting to do the release flights where they were doing the glide tests, and I saw the first and all of the glide tests out there. So it was a great time to be out there. There was just a lot going on.
Ron, you were an airline pilot for 30 years. You flew
36.
36 years.
Yes.
For United the whole time?
Yes.
And what were some of the types that you flew?
Well, I started out as a 737 engineer of all things. That was back in the time when they wanted a third pilot on the 737, but I was quickly able to get out of that. That was a terrible position. And then I was a 727 engineer, and I went from that into being a 737 co-pilot, then a 27 co-pilot, then a DC-10 co-pilot, and then I went into a 737 captain, then 727 captain, Airbus captain, A320, 319s, and then the 777. So I had a total of 25 years as captain on those various aircraft.
And how many years did you fly the 777?
13.
Okay.
And I got just under 8,100 hours on it as captain and line check airman. I instructed and gave check rides in it.
Okay, so highly experienced in the 777. And were you saying something to the effect of you were one of the first non-Boeing pilots to fly?
Yes, well, I was the first non-Boeing test pilot to fly the 777. I was chairman of the Airline Pilots Association New Aircraft Evaluation and Certification Committee, and we had a lot of meetings with Boeing. I was also the lead on the Working Together group with the airline pilots. So we had a lot of meetings with Boeing, a lot of interaction, and when the time came that they had developed the aircraft enough that they could have, non-Boeing test pilots get involved, I was fortunate enough to be the first one to get a flight in it. We had about a 5-hour flight. It was very interesting. I had a detailed test profile we went through, and I had a number of test flights on it before it was certified, and it was quite interesting because test pilots fly differently than airline pilots. And one of the things that we did, I have a group of pilots that I brought along, and we discovered a couple of issues. One of them was there was a 3 hertz longitudinal mode on final where it went into this little oscillation that was induced by a pilot input. And we had a gentleman who excited that mode, and it was kind of interesting. And the nice thing on these airplanes is they're extremely instrumented. And I got a call about a day later from John Cashman. He's the chief test pilot on the 777. He says, well, that funny thing we had on final, yeah, we figured that out. That was a longitudinal mode we had not seen before. And as a result, they put a 3 hertz filter in the flight control pitch system to take that out. So in the course of evaluating a lot of aircraft, and these are on my YouTube channel, I'm going through my evaluations that I perform about halfway through. And the last one was a C-17. They were thinking of trying to commercialize it as an MD-17, but that never came about. So there's a wide variety of stuff I got to fly. So this was one where we discovered the pitch mode, and in some of the other instances on other aircraft, we were able to, of course, put an airline pilot's perspective in. That's different from a test pilot's, because test flying is done on a beautiful clear day where it's nice. Airline flying is done in all type of weather, so it's a whole different ball game.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of differences. One is that also that a test pilot works closely with engineers and is really working as part of a team that is intimately familiar with all of the intricacies of the system, whereas an airline pilot really is just trying to operate it according to the procedures that have been laid down, doesn't need to know exactly where all the bits and bobs are connected. And you and I were talking offline earlier about how a lot of this stuff that in the pilot's operating handbook isn't strictly a representation of what's going on in the engineering, that there's a lot of intricacies that are kind of left out because the pilot just doesn't need to know that level of detail.
Exactly. And in fact, sometimes the test pilots don't even know the level of detail that exists. I mean, this is extremely specialized. I worked for Boeing while I was furloughed from United. I went in the Air Force, got hired by, after I got out of the Air Force, got hired by United, promptly furloughed because it was back in the 80s when the economy wasn't going well. I worked for Cessna Flight Test, Boeing Flight Test, and then worked as an electrical engineer. But I knew a lot of the electrical engineers. Like, I knew the guy who designed the cowling on the 737-300, and I knew the guy who designed the generator. I mean, when I went back to training, they would have a question in class, and well, you could get a work order, pay a lot of money, and ask Boeing the answer. I called up my friend and said, "Hey, how does this work?" So it was kind of fun. But I was flying the 777-300, and we were flying it just powered by the rat. And this is my example of test pilots don't necessarily know every little bit of thing that was going on. I was flying it just with rat power, and I wanted to see if I could essentially stall out or overpower the rat by making aggressive maneuvers, like, an airline pilot might be tempted to if he's in turbulence or that. And I'm making a very large roll inputs, and all of a sudden on the display there, the spoilers start being locked out, and I'm starting to lose spoilers. I still had plenty of roll control, but I was losing a bunch of spoilers in pairs. And I asked the chief test pilot on the Dash 300, Frank, I said, "What's going on here?" And he goes, "I don't know." Well, we later found out that, you don't want a spoiler ever to float if you have a hydraulic pressure issue. So the system was sensing that there was low pressure to the actuators, and it was saying, "Hey, we can't let these spoilers float, so we're going to lock them down." So it was starting to lock them down to protect the aircraft and the flight characteristics. And that was something that, the test pilots didn't quite realize. So they know a ton of stuff about the airplane because they have ungodly extensive meetings with engineers before they go up and do a specific test evaluating the system. But there is stuff that is so layered sometimes. And you kind of saw this on the MAX where the test pilots are actually kept out of the loop. That's a whole different subject. But a lot of times it is just so intricate that, it's almost like nobody can know everything.
Well, this is why I really wanted to talk to you about this stuff, Ron, because what I wanted to try to get at in this episode of the podcast is to try to understand if the pilot took it, which is controversial, but we're exploring this possibility. It is kind of what the officials think happened. But if the pilot took it, how would he have planned to do the things that we know were done? And specifically in this case, the satellite data unit was depowered and then repowered about an hour later. And this is something that I've talked to a lot of 777 pilots. It's not something that they're generally aware of how to do or would do the thing that you would have to do from the cockpit to isolate it, which would be to isolate either the entire left AC bus or the entire electrical system.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we just don't have that detail. I went through my manuals, and I've got the whole stack of, Boeing specific manuals they gave me that the airlines develop all their manuals from. And the electrical system, it's extremely basic. They simply do not go into the details. And the maintenance people only have enough information to troubleshoot. So for an airline pilot to get into the depth of the electrical system to know that he could exactly affect that system, because the system is also designed to prevent the pilots from doing dumb things. There's a lot of safeguards to protect them, and the systems are much more complex. I use the example of the 737 hydraulic system. You get the diagram, it looks very simple. Anybody who's walked into the center wheel well section of a 737 and looked at all the tubes, all the valves, all the differential things in there, it is a mass of plumbing and mechanisms, and that's not what the diagram shows. The diagram shows it very simply, but it's an extremely complex system with a level of depth that is way beyond what a pilot needs to know and what they're typically trained. I mean, you got to be in the engineering. So to specifically say, I am going to disable this system, I would be very interested in knowing how that person figured out for sure, because as you start degrading the electrical system, it still protects the ability of you to communicate and navigate. It's not as simple as the diagrams would show. So, I guess if you just depowered the whole aircraft, but, the APU is going to start, the RAT's going to deploy. It doesn't make it easy for you to do that.
And you've got this thing called the Electrical Load Management System, the ELMS, which is kind of an automated system that, kind of like you were talking earlier about how the plane was trying to protect hydraulic pressure by automatically decommissioning certain spoilers. The ELMS comes in and it will try to maintain power to crucial systems, even if you're trying to shut those things off.
Right. A lot of times that's for a lot of the high load systems, but there's other architecture there, not necessarily in the ELM system, but there's other architecture that tries to keep you from taking power away from systems that you really want unless you really have to.
Right.
I guess there's the thing that you could go down to the E&E bay, the electronics bay, but that would be, you have to go back near door one left. It's a 2 foot by 2 foot section there. You have to open it up. It's very obvious to anybody back in the cabin, first class area, because you're outside of the cockpit, what you're doing. So that would be a little strange to do that in flight. But of course, this is a strange situation from the beginning anyway.
I mean, one of the questions is, okay, so Zaharie said, "Good night, Malaysia 370." And then a minute later, they passed Agari and everything went dark. How long would it take to leave the cockpit, go back to the hatch, climb down into electronics bay, pull those circuit breakers if that's what you wanted to do, and then go back up to the cockpit? Is that something you could do in a minute?
It would probably take you, several minutes.
Okay.
You have to go out of the cockpit. You have to get down on the floor, pull up the carpeting. You release the lock latches, and then you open it up, and then you would go down the little ladder down there. And then it's a large area. It's really quite large, and there's a whole rack of the LRUs, the line replaceable units, all the little boxes for doing the various functions. So you would have to know exactly which one you're looking for and where it is. And down there are circuit breakers all over the place. When I was instructing new pilots, I would always take them down there because there's one very important thing that a pilot needs to know about that bay is there's a little gauge on the crew oxygen system, and it's a analog manual, direct reading gauge. We also have the gauge in the cockpit, and I was cruising one time back from the North Atlantic. I flown the airplane 777 all over the world. I was coming back from the North Atlantic, and all of a sudden the crew oxygen went to zero. Well, that means that if we had a sudden depressurization, we would have no oxygen. We'd pass out in seconds, and that is, of course, an extremely unfortunate event, and we would have to make a descent rapidly to get down 10,000 feet in case, this would happen. But by going back to the EE bay, you can open the door and look right down there, and you can see the gauge. And I went back there and I looked and saw that we had full pressure. It was just an instrumentation error. So that was about the one time.
So was going into the electronics bay something that you did? You did it that one time. Did you do it other times as well, or is it pretty rare? Apart from to show people.
Yeah, it's extremely rare. The only reason I've ever opened it up and gone down there is simply to show people what's down there. You can show them the actual control cables that come from the cockpit. You can show them where a bunch of circuit breakers are, but you really have no need as a pilot to ever go down there.
Interesting. Okay. So we basically know, because the satellite data unit was depowered, we know that whoever took the plane depowered it. We don't know, and to do that, they probably isolated the left AC bus. Although you are saying that it has been, the possibility has been raised, most notably by a YouTuber named Green Dot. I think Mentor Pilot mentioned it as well. The idea of isolating the entire electrical system of the plane, meaning turning off both main generators, both auxiliary generators, and preventing the APU from restarting, which would cause the rat to deploy. And it sounds like you had a plane in that state while you're doing your test flying.
Well, we purposely extended the rat. We didn't have a loss of actual hydraulics.
Oh, I see.
Being a flight test aircraft, we could shut off hydraulics, which you can do on the aircraft anyway. But because it was a flight test aircraft, fully instrumented in that, we could say we wanted to fly it, just with the rat powering the hydraulic system.
I see.
And we could do that. Without having to depower the system to cause it. Of course, you can extend the rat. Which is what we did. We just extended it manually.
I see. So the suggestion has been that somebody in the cockpit isolated the entire electrical system. It says in the operating handbook that you're not supposed to pull any circuit breakers,
right.
Unless you are directed to do so by the flight management system. So that you have a little screen in front of you that will tell you. In the olden days, you would have like a book of emergency check. Like when I fly a Cherokee, it has a little plastic laminated sheet that says, in case of emergency fire, do these 5 things, right?
Right.
But you don't have that nowadays. You have an electrical system that actually does a lot of these things itself, right?
Right. You have the electronic checklist, but we also have all the back, and this is the Boeing one, and I have my United manuals. The checklists that, of course, we have certain checklists that are emergency checklists that we have to memorize, like an emergency descent, engine fire, things like that. But we also have in our manuals, we have what we're supposed to be seeing on the electronic checklist. So we do have copies of that. We can see what's going on or what's supposed to be in there. So we've got a copy of that. But the nice thing about these electronic checklists is, and it's the standard scenario. You take off and you got an engine fire. Okay, well, you're gonna have to go through the fire checklist. You're gonna have to shut it down, possibly drift down, depending on where it occurred. You've got, do you think about restarting it while you don't for a fire? What about dumping? All these checklists come up. They're all integrated, and in like the 727, you could get lost in the checklist going back and forth between the various ones. But it all coordinates it, and when you do an item, it shows that you have done the item. Like I had to dump one time 200,000 pounds of fuel coming out of Beijing. We had a problem, and it shows that yes, I have opened the dump valves, and yes, I have set up the pumps properly, and yes, I am dumping. It all, as soon as you do it right there in the checklist, it goes green and it moves to the next step, and that's so helpful.
And so this is these are all things that are happening on this screen.
Yes.
And is this called the FMS?
The FM flight management system is different. This is part of the ICAS, the crew alerting system. Yeah.
Crew alerting system. Okay.
Or the electronic checklist, ECL, electronic checklist.
How many times in your career do you think roughly did you run a checklist for a real reason?
A number of times.
Okay.
Fuel dumping. I had a hydraulic problem one time. I had a hydraulic pump that was bad. Electrical things. It's not unusual at all to run a checklist.
And did those all come through the ICAS, or did you use the paper book?
Well, on the 777, it all came through the ICAS. They were all, that could have been our first enunciation, that you'd get a little ping and it would demonstrate, it would come up with the checklist saying, hey, you've got a problem here. And it brings it right up for you to run it.
And am I correct in understanding that if the plane has an electrical problem, the plane itself will try to do workarounds or shut things off, and so it might be telling you that it's doing it, but you don't actually have to do it yourself.
Right. A lot of things. The best example is a bleed air leak. because in that, typically, like on a 727, if you had a bleed air leak, you had to go through a procedure where you would try to isolate where the leak was so you could isolate that section. And these are important because that's hot air and it could damage the aircraft. It could actually result in a fire. So it's important that, you go through this checklist, you try to isolate it. And if you get a bleed air on the 777, well, the checklist comes up and it's fun to watch because it starts running through. It opens valve, it shuts valves, it says, I'll try this, and it runs through this procedure. And then when it gets done, it tells you, well, here was your problem here. It's been isolated and it's complete. Wow. And it's just fun. You sit there and watch the airplane do itself.
Wow.
It's really kind of cool. Yeah, it's amazing.
Wow. Okay. So, and I think you were, when we were speaking before, I was asking you about, like, under what conditions do you start pulling circuit breakers, given that the plane is doing all this stuff by itself? And I think you were saying that, like, there was someone did a study where they looked at people pulling circuit breakers, and, like, the number of times it had been done was 1 or 0 or something like that.
That might have been somebody else. I'm not familiar with that, but you're virtually never required. I looked through the procedures. I mean, there's tons of procedures, but I didn't see one where it ever called the crew to pull a circuit breaker for any reason.
Wow.
About the only reason you would do that is if maintenance say, hey, this system is totally enough, we're going to pull it, we're going to put a color on it. But that's usually was other aircraft like the 27 or even the Airbus. The systems all take care of themselves, so they isolate problems, and you really don't have to pull a circuit breaker. That's almost kind of old school design where, we want to totally isolate the system, but the airplane automatically does that.
So, to sum up, I think what we've been talking about, Ron, is that to do what was done, namely to isolate, let's say isolate the left AC bus, is a very unusual thing for a...
Oh, extremely.
Okay.
Yeah, the aircraft could isolate the bus if it had a major bus fault. I mean, that's basically, we could see in the aircraft, if you go down the electronics bay, you can see where, and I used to point out where the main buses are. I mean, they're very thick wires and where these are. And I guess if something catastrophic happened, like a big piece of metal fell on it and shorted out the bus, you would take the bus off. But typically, you would never have to isolate a bus, and to isolate the bus would take a lot of switch pushing. I mean, basically, you have to take the generator offline, you have to take the backup generator offline, you have to keep the transfer buses from transferring power to it, but the system is still going to try to power a lot of pieces of equipment. But it would be pretty difficult. I mean, you could do it. It doesn't happen typically normally. I don't know of anybody who's ever lost a left or right main bus. I mean, something that bad. You always lose little things, pumps, generators, stuff like that. You know, but you don't lose a whole bus typically. That'd be very rare.
So this event is hard to understand for a number of reasons. It's hard to understand what somebody was trying to accomplish by doing it. It's hard to understand why they would do it. It's very unusual and very extreme. And then we also would wonder why they would then undo it an hour later.
Exactly. It's strange. I mean, of course, we don't know. Of course, I think some people think they know, but no one really knows what happened here.
Yeah.
And so, what were the motivations? What was going on? What were they trying to do? And why would, depowering a bus and then an hour later powering it back up? I mean, it's just very strange.
Very strange. One of the speculations that Green Dot, the YouTuber Green Dot, had put forth was that after an hour, the equipment in the electronics bay that I guess hadn't been turned off was getting hot, and so they reconnected the electrical system so that a fan would start working. You sent me something yesterday indicating that you don't need a fan to cool the electronics at altitude.
No, that fan is mostly on the ground. Like if you were setting, we're going through a heat wave now. If you were setting at O'Hare and you don't have much air conditioning going on, It's typically provided by external air cart directly to the cabin. You don't have the air conditioning flow through the avionics bay. But when you're up at altitude, it's cold. The air is minus 60 degrees. You've got the differential pressure that the air is coming through and is being vented out. And there you don't really need the cooling fans. It's mostly a low altitude ground function where you need the cooling because the ambient temperatures are much higher. And of course, the other thing is if you shut off the bus, a lot of things aren't powered, so a lot of things aren't going to be generating heat.
Right. Yeah, that's a major point. Ron, I want to thank you for sharing all your expertise. I'd love to come back to you because you are just such a well of information, and you're such a talented YouTuber as well. So I talked to Juan Brown earlier, Blanco Lirio, and he sort of shares those characteristics with you, both very experienced 777 pilot and a really excellent YouTuber. So you guys are like I worship your expertise. But let me leave you with one final question, which is I've described this satellite data unit being powered and repowered, the bus that would have to be isolated to do that. Is there anything that you as a 777 captain, when you hear that this happened, you think, well, it's a bit of a stretch, but maybe he was doing X? Is there anything that kind of crosses your mind as a possibility there?
Not really. I mean, if he was trying to disappear and cut off all, transmissions, but again, the airplane talks a lot to the outside world. I was flying once to Hawaii, and I get a call from maintenance that says, "We're watching that oil quantity on your right engine. It's decreasing more than we like." And I'm going, well, first of all, I didn't realize anybody was actually watching that. I guess, I think they're sent the data and then they get an alert. And I brought it up. I hadn't realized it, and it wasn't enough of a quantity loss that I would have typically even noticed. But I thought it was interesting that here I am flying, enjoying a nice flight out to Hawaii, thinking about my nice layover, and somebody's watching my oil quantity there.
That's incredible. That's incredible. But if you had wanted to go dark, you wanted to go invisible for your own nefarious purposes, you could from the panel in front of you, you can deselect the SATCOM, right? And you can turn off the IFE.
Right. As far as I remember, it was never anything we needed to do or wanted to do, really. So, truthfully, I can't tell you if I would be able to disconnect it. I mean, I can not use it. Right. And I cannot use the HF, UHF, VHF. Right. I mean, those are functions I cannot use. But as far as actually shutting it off, I guess you can turn off the head or that. But yeah, because ACARS I think uses HF even. A lot of stuff goes on in the background that pilots don't know about.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of mysterious stuff really that we don't know about, don't need to know about, and
it doesn't really behoove you to know about it. I mean, it doesn't really make it doesn't allow you to do your job better. For the pilot to have taken this flight requires somebody who had knowledge above and beyond what any 777 captain I've ever talked to has, and maybe even going beyond the documentation that the airlines give them in terms of the operating handbook and so forth. Because as you say, even the test pilots don't know all the intricacies of the wiring and so forth.
Right. The only way to know, the intricacies of the wiring would be to have a contact at Boeing and have a contact in a specific area, and that's you would have to call Fred, who worked on that system, and you would have to talk to him and say, how does this work, and can you send me a diagram? And he probably can't because it's proprietary.
Right.
It would take knowledge that is just not readily accessible. I mean, I have bins full of material that I've been given on all. I mean, I have gone to so many meetings with manufacturers, it's ridiculous. But I have literally I've thrown away a lot of stuff, but I have literally bins that I kept out in my hangar, and I brought them back when I started to do these YouTube things. And I just have tons of information, but again, very seldom does it ever go into the level of detail I mean, sometimes the military does, because that's more the way the military operate. And I've got the handbooks on the C-17 and stuff like that. But still, that you just don't get that level of detail in the systems. The normal people don't have it.
Yeah, it's very, very baffling and really profound. Ron, thank you so much for taking the time. And I want anyone who's watching this show to check out Ron Rogers' YouTube channel. Fascinating stuff. You cover historical aircraft, modern aircraft, your own flying that you do for fun, the flying that you've done in the olden days, and it's for anyone who loves aviation. It's a real treat, a real smorgasbord.
Well, the olden days.
The olden days. I can say that. I'm old enough codger myself at this point.
I guess it is the olden days. When I was a brand new hire, this captain was complaining about the good old days, and I finally said to him, I said, Captain, these are my good old days.
Yeah. There's still that. We still live in the good old days. Ron, thank you so much. And we hope to see you again.
Thanks, Jeff. Take care.
Once again, I am deeply grateful to Ron. I want to thank him for all of his help and expertise. I would love to have him on again. We don't have time for a community radar today, so we'll get to that next week, hopefully. And one more time, please, if you're enjoying this show, hit like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on audio, please rate, review, and recommend it to your friends. For now, this has been Finding MH370, Episode 5. And to all the listeners and viewers out there, don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. So long and thanks.